Hi, so thank you for still paying attention to this presentation. Given that I only have a limited amount of time, let's get right into it. So I want to talk about William Edward Burkhardt Du Bois and the whole idea of critical race theory as articulated in his monumental book, The Souls of Black Folk. Critical race theory really evolved out of a response to racism and racial conditions in the US. Um, and so while critical race theory as a term was coined later in 1970s and 1980s, critical theories of race in the US go back to the 1950s and early 20th centuries with roots in the writings of prominent intellectual activists such as Friedrich Douglass or Sojourner Truth and W.E.B. Du Bois among them. What makes critical race theory critical is that its major aim is to uncover and critique racially oppressive social structures, meanings, and ideas for the purpose of combating racism. As such, the two major objects of study and thought for critical theories of race are, unsurprisingly, race and racism. So, with regards to race, critical race theories presented a major challenge to theories that understand race as something that's essential or biologically ingrained in humans. So, for critical race scholars, racial categories like black, white, Latino, Asian, mulatto, quadroon, etc., are really social constructions produced not by biology, but by social relationships, cultural meanings, and institutions like law, politics, religion, and the state. And so they've criticized understandings of racism that simply see it as a result of individual prejudices and hateful acts. And rather, they've developed a more structural and systematic understanding of racism, which is often termed institutional racism, um, that theorizes racism as embedded not only in individual minds but also in the social relationships, practices, and institutions. So these social structures and relationships shapes individual minds and identities and allocate economic, political, and social resources like decent housing, voting rights, and dignity in racially unequal ways. And Elder Vass keeps coming to mind. So, having that be the context, who is W.E.B. Du Bois? Um, he was born on February 23rd, 1868, in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. Died August 27, 1963, in Accra, Ghana. He's an American born sociologist, historian, civil rights activist, Pan African theorist. He first attended Fisk University, where he completed his bachelor's, then attended Harvard for a second bachelor's, graduated cum laude in history, completed graduate work at the University of Berlin, and then later went back to Harvard to complete a PhD, um, and became the first African American to earn a PhD at Harvard. His dissertation was on the suppression of the African slave trade in the United States of America. So that's his education. Professionally, he was a professor of history, sociology, and economics at Atlanta University. He was the co-founder of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, which started in 1909. As a social theorist, he's arguably one of the most imaginative, perceptive, and prolific founders of the sociological discipline. Um, in addition to leading the Pan African movement and being an activist for civil rights for African Americans, Du Bois was a pioneer of urban sociology, an innovator um, of rural sociology, a leader in criminology, the first American sociologist of religion, most notably the first great social theorist of race. So Phil Zuckerman's book, The Social Theory of W.E.B. Du Bois, is touted really as the first book to examine Du Bois's writing from a sociological perspective and emphasize his theoretical contributions on race relations, international relations, labor, economics, politics, on women, on religion, on crime, and on education. So you can see that Du Bois, as a social theorist, has his hand in a number of different subjects. So why is he so important? Um, Du Bois's contributions on to critical theory and Africana critical theory specifically is important because he's perhaps most distinguished for his passionate pro-woman politics, or what Michael Ackwood calls his male feminism. He's also well noted for bringing various dimensions of critical theory, anti-racism, anti-colonialism, anti-capitalism, into a full-fledged critical socio-theoretical framework. He's also, Du Bois claimed in his classic essay, The Study of Negro Problems in 1898, that the omission of persons of African descent from the realm of social scientific study and their relegation and reduction to paradigms par excellence of pathology when they are studied robs all true lovers of humanity who hold higher the pure ideals of science of the rigorous and the robust practice of a truly human science. So he believed that excluding the blacks from the subject of social study was, in essence, to do injustice to social science. Du Bois is also, important because of his contribution to women's sociology in his, long life, which he lived to be 95 years old. He wrote several books, including The Souls of Black Folk, which was a powerful, creatively written text that is today considered a classic social history. Um, and so in this book, Du Bois really talks that about the fact that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, right? And he sets the ground for critical theory, race theory, in that book because he argues in the fourth outlet that was, in fact, the problem of the 20th century. Notably, he presented his thoughts um, later at a conference, which was the first Pan African conference in London during 1900. And notably, at the close of the conference, delegates later adopted his paper, which was entitled Address to the Nations of the World. And this document led to the adoption of what has now become a bigger framework for the UN Declaration, which acknowledges and seeks to protect the rights of people of African descent, and in addition, indigenous people, etc. Right? So within this book, um, the question, what is the problem of the color line, right? David Lewis writes about the biography of race in W.E. Du Bois, and in it, Morris argues that while Karl Marx believed that the wheel moving history forward was class conflict, and Max Weber thought it was bureaucratic rationalization, Du Bois argued that it was, in fact, the color line, right? And so, in his short essay on the Negro and the Warsaw Ghetto, Du Bois wrote about his three trips to Poland, particularly his third in 1949, which he viewed the remains of the Warsaw Ghetto. And he writes, the problem of race in which I was interested cut across lines of color and physique and belief, and Strawson was a matter of cultural patterns, perverting teaching and human hate and prejudice, which reach all sorts of people and cause endless evils to all men. So what this demonstrates is later his development of thought that the issue was not just contextualized to black people, but to every other kind of race in which people were being oppressed, right? And so his notion of discrimination expanded to take on different forms also in different places and to go beyond the concept of race. So another idea that Du Bois put forward in the book was this whole idea of double consciousness, right? And the quote is there. I'm not going to read it because of the interest of time, and certainly we can go back and look at it. But really, it talks about this challenge to be oneself um, culturally while having to be something else as a citizen. So, for example, as a citizen of Canada, one has to be a certain way, but one may be from a different culture, which requires different actions of them. And so this whole idea of double consciousness um, refers to the sociological and psychological experience of seeing the world through the lens of both American and African American. The broader application of the concept refers to the experience of seeing oneself as divided into several parts, which he would argue prevented a unified self from developing, right? So this is probably one of his most famous contributions um, to the world of sociology. And so the concept of double consciousness or the double self resembles other key concepts which we know or which we discuss in social theory. Um, Most notably, George Simmel's stranger. So for Simmel, the stranger is a social role that combines the seemingly contradictory qualities of nearness and remoteness. So the stranger is connected to the broader social community by only the most general and generic commonalities, yet he is still relied on by a large group of people. The value of the stranger lies in the ability to bring objectivity and something new to society. So that's how Simmel presents it. Feminist theory, Dorothy Smith, for example, talks about this bifurcated consciousness, where she argues that the sociologist cannot distance itself from the objects of its study, but rather the sociologist is also subject with his or her own experiences, right? So the cognitive location of the sociologist or researcher as both object and subject is really the bifurcation of consciousness. And then you have, Edward Said and Frank Fanon, which talks about the mask, and really from a post-colonial theorist standpoint, they talk about this experience as the other, which the mask is an extension of the veil, and this metaphor investigates in part the psychology of racism and dehumanization that is inherent in situations of colonial domination. And then we've heard extensively about this whole other in research, which is really a development of what Du Bois has put forward as double consciousness. So why are these significant in education and what is their value? So while we may think of race in terms of individual bodies and racism as purely about individual prejudices, critical race scholars have shown that race and racism are intricate parts of social history and the larger social order. So even when certain prejudices go away, racial inequality can perpetuate itself through larger social systems like education. And so this is why education requires more than an infusion of what has been called culturally relevant pedagogy into the curriculum. So really Du Bois helps us to see that race and racism have social sources and consequences and encourages us to critique systems of racial dominance with the hope of helping us create more racially just society, right? So if we think about double consciousness in terms of research or wearing the veil, he gives an example here of a black artisan who is conflicted between producing goods that reflect his own unique perspective and life experiences and goods that are marketable and acceptable to a broader population. So the artisan is engaged in a battle of double aim. So on one hand, he's working to create what is the best expression of himself, um, but if he does that, he'll be deemed unsuccessful. And by creating what makes him successful, he fails to express himself and in some ways may appear to be rejecting his true self. So we can think about that in terms of having to produce something academically, right? But also having to kind of be keen about how we present ourselves, right? The significance, and time is running out, the significance of Du Bois for education is that he presents a multi-methodological approach. So it's deeply dialectical, it's critical of traditional disciplines, contribution to social activist traditions, concepts of the complementary of methodologies, and he offers alternative explanations, um, and he's really a prefigure for all that we know about post-humanist, post-structuralist, postmodernist thought. So a systematic study of Marxism, race, class theories, critical social theory was all first done by Du Bois. And I have 6 seconds, so most people believe he has been denied the recognition he deserves.